Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Trumpet Daily. In 2009, my father wrote a landmark booklet called Haggai, God Has Begun to Shake the Nations. In it, he expounded on God's promise in Haggai 2 in verse 7, which says, "And I will shake all nations." Now in Haggai 2, God makes it plain that the shaking of the nations is tied directly to a specific sign. God calls this physical sign His house, a magnificent physical structure designed to declare the glory of God, and from which God's truth flows. In the booklet, my father explained how God begins to shake all nations at the same time as this house for God is constructed. God intends for this house, he wrote, to be a sign of world upheaval. In September 2010, we opened Armstrong Auditorium, a majestic building created specifically to declare the glory of God and from which the truth of God now flows. And in looking at world events, since the opening of this building, there is no refuting that the intensity of this shaking has dramatically increased. Practically the whole of the Middle East and North Africa has been rocked by violent uprisings and civil wars in nations like Egypt, Libya, and Syria. In Europe, we've seen a massive economic earthquake alter the landscape of the entire continent, mostly to Germany's benefit. And then there's the dramatic decline of the United States. Look at how fast this nation has fallen just in the last few years. I'd like to show you just one statement from my father. This is going back to January of 2008, and it was at the groundbreaking ceremony for this very building. Take a look.
So this house is going to be built rapidly, and we're going to see at the same time as this work spirals upward that the conditions in this world, and especially in Israel, are going to go down even faster. And I mean, the signs are every place, and it's just amazing to me how all these world events are tied in with this house for God. And
now, by Israel, of course, he means the United States and Britain primarily, the end-time descendants of ancient Israel, in other words. Israel, as he brought out there, is going down, and it's only going to accelerate now that God's house has been constructed. The signs are every place, as he said in January of 2008. Now, all of this shaking of the nations, and really we haven't even looked at the so-called natural disasters that have happened in recent years, all the tornadoes, the floods, the fires, drought. Over the weekend, as you probably saw, tens of thousands of Filipinos were seen sifting through the wreckage caused by what some are now calling the world's biggest storm. TheTrumpet.com filed this report earlier today.
We've witnessed what some have called perhaps the greatest natural disaster on record with Typhoon Haiyan. Inevitably, the death toll will climb higher. Even now, at least 10,000 people are estimated to have been killed in a single city in the Philippines' eastern seaboard. Lethal wind gusts topping 200 miles per hour and a storm surge of about 20 feet have been reported. An estimated 4 million people have been affected by this gargantuan storm, according to a Filipino National Disaster Agency. Hundreds of thousands of people in the typhoon's path have already been evacuated as various nations pledge aid and support to the disaster relief efforts. As the storm finally passes and the full scope of destruction becomes clear, many will inevitably ask the question, why? At times like this, perhaps more than any other, people tend to charge God with blame. How could a loving God allow this to happen? The truth is that the Bible does explain why God allows disasters like this one and the lesson they can teach. And it also clearly reveals the cause.
Of course, the Bible does answer why natural disasters, and we talk about that at length in our booklet by that very name. We produced that just a couple of years ago, and it's already out of date. Look at what's happening, or what has happened since. And you add to what we've discussed on this program, all the literal shaking of nations, the massive earthquakes that have pounded Indonesia and Argentina, Pakistan, down in New Zealand in 2011. That same year, the earthquake just off the coast of Japan that led to that killer tsunami. This year, we had heard things had supposedly quieted down. Not as many tornadoes or hurricanes. And then, as we saw over the weekend, parts of the Philippines were completely flattened by that typhoon. If you want to know where we are in Bible prophecy, you'd better understand why God is shaking the nations, my father wrote in that Haggai booklet. That means you must obey God, watch world news, and pray for understanding. Now, he wrote that, as I said at the top, in 2009, and since that time, the world has become much more dangerous and unstable. This morning here in Edmond, we had a small earthquake. It was actually our third one over the last 24 hours. And while these are nothing compared to the devastating events that we've witnessed around the world in recent years, I do think it's interesting that the earthquakes here in Oklahoma are much more frequent than they used to be. According to one of our local weathermen, from 1975 to 2008, Oklahoma had about 1 to 3 earthquakes per year that topped 3.0 on the Richter scale. But starting in 2009, he said, we've had about 40 of these earthquakes per year. Now that represents an increase of about 4,000%, as he said. Now again, these are small earthquakes that only rattle windows and light fixtures. But if our eyes are open to what's happening on earth, then we should be able to see that our world is rattling. And since 2009, the frequency and the intensity of these tremors is growing.
The Philadelphia Church of God presents the Trumpet Daily.
On Friday's program about Winston Churchill, the bus that they put in the Capitol building, we talked about the unraveling alliance between the United States and Britain. And biblical Judah, the Mideast nation of Israel, is sort of like the neglected child of that broken home. Manasseh, the scriptures say, shall devour Ephraim, and Ephraim, Manasseh, that's the United States and Britain. And then the prophet Isaiah went on to write, and together, Ephraim and Manasseh together shall be against Judah. That's from Isaiah 9 and verse 21. Now on Friday, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry was in Israel trying to jumpstart the negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians. And during a television interview there in the Middle East that played in Palestine and Israel as well, Kerry called into question the seriousness of Israel's desire for peace with the Palestinians. It was a pretty sharp rebuke, and Prime Minister Netanyahu returned the favor. Now, when Secretary Kerry was in Israel, or while he was there, news broke about this emerging nuclear deal between Western powers and Iran, which then prompted Kerry to abruptly adjust his travel plans and to leave Israel in a rush for Geneva, where he could negotiate with Iran. And this left the Israeli officials dumbfounded. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu just couldn't believe it. He said, this is a very bad deal, the deal the West was about to get into. And then he went on to release this very pointed statement. Take a look.
I met Secretary Kerry right before he leaves to Geneva. I reminded him that he said that no deal is better than a bad deal. And the deal that is being discussed in Geneva right now is a bad deal. It's a very bad deal. Iran is not required to take apart even one centrifuge. But the international community is relieving sanctions on Iran for the first time after many years. Iran gets everything that it wanted at this stage, and it pays nothing. And this is when Iran is under severe pressure. I urge Secretary Kerry not to rush to sign, to wait, to reconsider, to get a good deal. But this is a bad deal, a very, very bad deal. It's the deal of the century for Iran. It's a very dangerous and bad deal for peace in the international community.
Now, the day after Netanyahu made that statement, Reuters released a story, this was on Saturday, November the 9th, titled "Crisis Brewing in U.S.-Israeli Relations." Let me just read a few excerpts from this article on Saturday. It says, Israeli news reports describe Netanyahu as being in shock over the possible Iranian compromise. Netanyahu, who sees Iran as an arch-enemy, has vowed to do anything, including a military strike, to prevent Iran from reaching weapons capability. That's what he was so furious about, was that the deal, which is basically a deal to just get Iran to the negotiating table, didn't do anything to dismantle this nuclear program that they're now constructing. Reuters goes on and says, Obama and Netanyahu took office just months apart in 2009, but seemed to share little in common. At joint appearances, they appeared uncomfortable and even occasionally sparred. It says the lack of chemistry seems rooted in vastly different worldviews, and we would certainly agree with that, and we've talked and written a lot about it in the last few years. It says Obama is a proponent of diplomacy and consensus, while Netanyahu believes Israel can trust no one and must protect itself. I'm not sure he thinks exactly like that, but this is Reuters after all. While negotiators in Geneva hammered out details Saturday, the discussed deal appeared to include some relief from painful economic sanctions in exchange for limits on Iranian nuclear activity. And then it concludes here by saying, but Netanyahu has said international pressure should be increased, not eased, until Iran dismantles all suspicious nuclear activities. That position puts him at odds with the U.S. as the White House urges Congress to hold off on new sanctions while negotiations are underway. And we talked about this even last week, where he's pleading, or the White House is putting pressure on Congress to hold off on any new sanctions. Now, the same day when all this news broke, Friday, when Kerry headed off to Geneva and Netanyahu responded with that furious reaction, there was another story also in the news about how the sanctions on Iran had actually been eased months ago when President Rouhani was voted in back at the early part of the summer. This was at the Daily Beast. The title of the article, Obama's Secret Iran Détente. It says the Obama administration began softening sanctions on Iran after the election of Iran's new president in June, months before the current round of nuclear talks in Geneva, or the historic phone call between the two leaders in September. So even before there was any kind of talk or discussion, you had, just because the one who led the charm offensive was voted in June, the one who was handpicked by the mullahs, we should add, just because he took a softer tone, immediately the United States started to reward Iran for their soft talk. It says, while those negotiations now appear on the verge of a breakthrough, the key condition for Iran, relief from crippling sanctions, began quietly and modestly 5 months ago. And then it goes on and gives some of the proof of that easing of sanctions, going back, as it says there, 5 months. Now, I just want to go back to Hosea 5. We concluded with this also in the program Friday on that Churchill bust, but we had talked about that verse in Isaiah, which I mentioned earlier, and then also there's a verse in Zechariah 11 talking about the band of the brotherhood being broken between Judah and Ephraim and Manasseh. And then Hosea 5, verse 13, it says, when Ephraim saw his sickness and Judah saw his wound, then went Ephraim to the Assyrian and sent to King Jareb, yet could he not heal you nor cure you of your wound. We talked about sick Ephraim as it goes to Assyria eventually, once the United States is out of the picture and that relationship between Ephraim and Manasseh breaks. But here today we can concentrate more on that wound. And I mean, what better word is there in the Bible to describe what's happened to little Judah over the last 20 years since the so-called peace process began? It's brought nothing but war and violence to Israel. And here we can see what it's leading to in Hosea 5 and verse 13. That wound, that gaping wound is going to lead Judah right into the arms of Germany, Assyria, modern day Assyria. That's where this is headed, and we've had quite a lot here of late, but certainly over the last 15 years as well, about this coming alliance between Judah and Assyria. This was from thetrumpet.com on November 7th, just last week. Germany is one of Israel's largest trading partners and has sought to expand that trade relationship, as evidenced by increased air transport between the countries and cooperative agreements across the fields of entertainment, medicine, science, technology, biotech, agriculture, transportation, manufacturing, and the military. That's from an article titled Israel's Trust in Germany is Growing. And just from the Trumpet Weekly, which we send out every Friday afternoon, if you're a subscriber, you can subscribe freely, by the way, at thetrumpet.com. But this is from page 4 in the November 8th issue, just this past Friday. Israel's infatuation with Berlin, the article reads, just about anything that has to do with Germany's capital seems to be hip in Israel's largest cities, particularly amongst the youth, it says, particularly amongst the youth. So there's changes happening between these two peoples with this very difficult and tortured history that's in many cases in living memory for some. But we see the trends beginning to change among the young people, and that's significant. And so is what's happening, you know, right at the top tier of government in both Judah and the United States, as we saw from this sharp dispute between Israel and the U.S. just this past weekend. Back up to verse 5, we read this on Friday as well. It says, and the pride of Israel does testify to his face. Therefore shall Israel and Ephraim fall in their iniquity. Judah, it says, also shall fall with them. So that's what it's leading to. I could take you over to Daniel 11. We'll do that at a later time, where it talks about the clash, the coming clash between the heart of Europe, between the power in Assyria or Germany today and Iran, and how the United States is not even in that picture because we've already fallen. Well, here you see why we fall together with brothers, Ephraim, and also with Judah. So we'll certainly have more to say about this breaking alliance between the United States and Judah in upcoming programs and also at thetrumpet.com. I just wanted to take a few moments here at the end to thank some of you who've responded to the new format that we've put together here for the Trumpet Daily. We encourage you to keep providing that feedback and to also keep informed. I mentioned the Trumpet Weekly a moment ago. At the top of the program, we talked about the Haggai booklet. That certainly is available to anyone who will request it, free of charge. I mentioned too, I believe, the booklet we put together in 2011 about why natural disasters. So there's plenty of literature that you can follow on this program with and really continue your study in much greater depth. As far as programs coming up, we've got a lot. This latest Trumpet Weekly talks about beware the well-educated technocrats. It goes back to the speech that Congressman Lankford gave here in this House last week or a couple of weeks ago. And Mr. Hilliker in this article keys in on a particular statement that Congressman Lankford made about the ruling class in Washington. So we're going to develop that a little bit in future Trumpet Dailies. And also there's been a lot going on here on campus with concerts. We recently had the Canadian Brass perform, and then the new Edmund Chamber Orchestra just the other day. So we'll have some clips and some highlights from these recent performances, keeping you informed about what's happening in your world and also what's going on this campus. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you again next time.